By now you know that I'm a fan of examples, so let's get into one to understand how this lexical environment works. Let's say we've got code. So let's understand how this code works. I've blurred out the last statement, and that's just when we're going to execute this function. But for now, we haven't executed this. We've just declared all these variables and functions. So what's going to happen in the creation phase? Well, remember what we said. A global execution context is going to be created. That was one of the beginning lectures we looked at. But remember, now we're digging deeper into what this means. What does a global execution context contain? Well, we've seen it contains two environments, the lexical environment and the variable environment. And in all practical purposes, they're the same. But there's a few subtle differences which we discussed. Let's look at the lexical environment. Remember, each lexical environment holds three pieces of information. The environment record, and here it's just going to be variables defined via let and const, which is A and B. And it's going to be the function. That's the first thing. It's also going to hold an outer reference to the outer environment. And here the outer environment is null. Why is it null? Well, think about it. We're already in the global execution context. So there is nothing outside of that. That's why it's null. And what is the this binding going to be? 100%. It's going to be the global object. I hope this is making sense. And what about the variable environment? What's going to happen there? Well, again, each environment holds three pieces of information. Here, the environment record's going to be dealing with the var keyword. That's the only difference between the variable environment and the lexical environment. So C is going to be undefined. The outer environment is still going to be referencing null, and the this binding is still going to be referencing the global object. Ooh, but you know what's interesting with this? And I hope you picked it up. Can you notice the difference between the variable C and the variable A and B? Unlike variables declared with var, which all start with the value of undefined, let and const variables are not initialized until their definition is evaluated. And this just means accessing the variables before their initialization will result in a reference error. So it's quite an important distinction we've just picked up there. Okay, cool. So we've done the creation phase. What's next? Well, that's right, the execution phase of this context, of this execution context. And all that does is it assigns values to the variables. So A and B have the value of 20 and 30. Value C stays undefined because we've never assigned it a value. Okay, so far so good. But what happens now when we execute the function? Well, remember what we said, that there are two types of execution context. The first was a global one, and that's done automatically when we write code, and we just saw that now. But now we've executed a function. So what's the second type of execution context? Yes, a functional execution context. And this will be at the top of the stack. And again, each execution context within it has a lexical environment and a variable environment. And what's in this lexical environment? Well, here we have our function. In the environment record, we've got our function type, which in this case is declarative. We've got arguments, and we have an index of arguments. The first argument is 10, the second argument is 20, and it also stores this length property. Now, when we look at a reference to the outer environment, look at this. And this makes sense. It's not null anymore because now we're sitting on top of the stack, and there is an outer lexical environment to reference, and that is the global lexical environment. And when it gets to the this binding will also be referencing the global object in this instance, or if we're using strict mode, it will be undefined. And the variable environment pretty much has the same things. I don't have to go over those again. And very similar to what we just saw with the global execution context, it's going to go through the execution phase. And that's where it assigns the values and variables and executes the function. I really hope this is starting to sink in. And for the sake of completeness, and even for making this sink in more, let's do a few examples together. Let's start getting more comfortable with how this all works.